Hello everyone, welcome to my messy studio and my art channel. My name is Mark and I'm an artist and an art professor. Some time ago I posted a video on 3 different pen and ink drawing methods: the parallel hatching technique, where hatching is applied in a single direction, the cross-hatching technique, where hatching is applied at different angles, and my personal favorite, the contour cross-hatching technique, where hatching follows the forms being depicted. Then, a little later, I made a video where I demonstrated cross-contour hatching in detail. Both those videos were relatively well received, at least by the modest numbers of my channel. So in this video, we're going to take an even deeper dive and talk about 3 different historical styles of cross-contour hatching. As usual, along the way, I'm going to show you how to do these techniques and give you some old master examples of how they were used. Let's get started. The first method I'm going to call curly hatching, since there doesn't seem to be an official name to it. The style is probably the oldest of the 3, being widely used in Northern Europe in the 15th and 16th centuries in both drawing and printmaking. It consists, as the name suggests, of short, curly strokes applied at different angles. Here's a wonderful example of curly hatching by Albrecht Dürer. The curly hatching is particularly effective in rendering the complex interplay of crumpled folds in these pillows, but Dürer also applied curly hatching to other subjects, such as this portrait. Curly hatching ranges in style, with some artists rendering more realistically, with the hatching closely conforming to the forms being depicted, while in other artists, like Jacob de Gain II, the curvature of the hatch marks becomes exaggerated and almost decorative, taking on a calligraphic flourish. Here's how curly hatching works on a simple sphere. A good way to start is to fill the entire shadow area with a series of hatch marks that follow the curves. Once you have the shadows filled in, you can start to apply a second layer to build up the value and establish the core shadow and reflected light. Keep the strokes short and make sure that each hatch mark has enough difference in angle from the hatch mark below it so that the intersections are clear. This takes constant attention because the angles of the hatching are constantly shifting. The most important thing is to stay consistent with your curves, meaning that if your first layer curves up, all subsequent layers should also do the same. Keep in mind that this type of hatching can get messy if you build up too many layers, so don't apply more than 3 layers of hatch. This isn't the easiest way of working because it requires you to constantly curve your hatching, but the good thing is that because you're generally using shorter strokes, this technique is more gradual and fairly easy to control. This is a fun, energetic way of working that feels light and playful, imbuing your drawings with warmth and, to my mind, a touch of humor. I would say the only drawback to it is that it's a style that's closely associated with the Northern Renaissance, so it might not be a good match for something that needs to have a more modern look. Getting good at curly hatching, like most hatching technique, requires consistent practice, and the best way to start is just to simply put down a bunch of curly strokes of different lengths. For this type of hatching, I find it helps to rotate your paper to get the angle that you want, but you should also practice putting down curly strokes at different angles without rotating your paper. Rendering a sphere is also very good practice to build your dexterity, but it's not such an easy exercise to do, so don't get frustrated if it's not perfect. The strangely contradictory thing about drawing is that sometimes more complex irregular forms are easier to render than simple volumes. So you'll find that once you move on from butchering a bunch of spheres, drawing other things using curly hatching won't be all that hard. The next method, also popular in Europe in the 15th and 16th centuries, I couldn't find a name for, so let's give it one: the thick, thin hatch. This method is mostly done in either 1 or 2 layers and relies heavily on line thickness for building up values. This technique was used to wonderful effect by the French Baroque engraver Jacques Callot in these series of prints depicting various roguish street characters. This technique requires a pen with a very flexible nib. The first step is to hatch the shadow side of the form in a long curved pattern, and then widen the line where you see the darker core shadow. Space out the hatch marks to accommodate the large line variation. Then repeat the same process with a second layer of hatch with a large angle difference, again pressing down to widen the lines in the core shadow area. Once you're done with these two layers, you can extend thin lines from the hatch marks to soften the transitions. This is a wonderfully calligraphic way of rendering that definitely takes a lot of practice, but I love the calligraphic precision required as well as its boldness and efficiency. My personal preferred hatching method is much busier than this, often utilizing many layers to gradually build up the contrast, but I really appreciate the precise conservation of strokes required with this way of working, where every hatch mark has to be just the right thickness and in the right spot. This requires a very steady hand, but with practice yields some very interesting results and would be great for small illustration work. I would start by practicing by trying your hand at drawing straight, thick and thin lines, and then moving on to more complex curves. The trick is really to keep the spacing between the lines consistent. And of course, a well-performing flex pen is required, so if you don't have one, look through my many videos on the subject for my personal recommendations. And here is the third method, one that I often use in my work. Since once again it lacks a name, we're going to call it chisel hatching. It requires us to put down long straight hatching at the beginning of the rendering process to block in large areas of shadow before moving to shorter, more curving layers of hatch to define smaller shifts in form and value. The reason why I call it chisel hatching is because it mimics the process a sculptor would use to carve a block of stone, starting with a large chisel to block in the general shapes, and then moving to smaller and smaller chisels for the details. This style of hatching was utilized by Michelangelo and Raphael, and given their enormous influence, is still utilized today. This method is fairly tricky because it requires you to make very long, straight, consistent hatching. The easiest way to do this is to rotate your paper to maintain the easiest angle to hatch from. The first step is to put down 1 or 2 layers of straight hatch to separate the lights from the shadows. Try to make this hatching as long as possible, but if you can't fill in the entire form, you can work in patches. The direction of these first 2 layers is not important, since basically what you're doing is treating the hatch marks as pure value. Just make sure that the angles between the 2 hatching layers is large enough to show clear intersections. While normally I do not advise that you place straight hatching on curved forms, the reason this works here is that these hatched lines are very close together, which allows the hatching to fuse into value from a distance. After blocking in the shadow, you can start to refine the forms and the values with smaller hatching in different directions. While this method allows for way more layers than either curly hatching or thick-thin hatching, I wouldn't go over 4, since you risk making the hatching look confused and messy. I find that this technique, with its initial indication of the division between light and shadow, to be faster than the other 2 methods. And because it uses multiple layers of hatching to gradually build up the values, it's easier to do. While it's great for more finished work, this can also be used for quick pen and ink studies. And while the previous 2 styles might look antiquated, chisel hatching doesn't have that old-timey look and might be the more appropriate choice for modern-looking work. That said, who cares whether your work looks modern or not? Pick a style based on what you love, and not how it might be perceived by others. It's all going to feel antiquated in 50 years anyway. So, there you have it. 3 cross-contour hatching techniques to try out and see if they work for you. I hope you found this tutorial useful, and if you did, click subscribe and stay tuned for many more videos like this one. Thanks for watching, and see you all next time. Bye-bye.